Today we're out here in cloudy Nashville, Tennessee, taking a look at the 2017 Nissan Rogue Sport. This is an all-new model for America, however it has been on sale in other world markets for a while. In Canada, Europe, and the rest of the world, this is known as the Nissan Qashqai. However, in America, they decided that was a little bit too hard to spell, a little bit too hard to pronounce, and they wanted to build on the momentum from the Nissan Rogue. In another interesting twist, the Canadian version of the Qashqai and the American Nissan Rogue Sport are actually the same vehicle, and they have a slightly different front look, slightly different rear look, and slightly different suspension tuning versus the European Qashqai. The big difference between the Rogue Sport and the Rogue is exactly what we see in the Hyundai Santa Fe and the Hyundai Santa Fe Sport. This is larger than the model without the Sport tagline. We don't see the third row in the back either. Although some parts of the Rogue and Rogue Sport are directly shared, the front end is not one of them. We actually have a different grille right here. It's a little bit slimmer, a little bit sleeker than we see in the larger Rogue. We still have the same sort of chevron style LED trims right here inside the optional full LED headlamp modules. Our model also has fog lamps right down here below, and because we're in the top end model, we have a 360-degree camera right here below the Nissan logo, and this section hides the optional radar adaptive cruise control sensor because all of those options are available in the Rogue Sport. Some of you on Facebook were asking if the Rogue Sport was meant to replace the Nissan Juke. We don't really know the answer to that question at the moment. Nissan wouldn't say. Personally, I expect the Juke to carry on because this is not nearly as small as the Nissan Juke. This is 172.4 inches long, which means this is about 3 inches larger than a Honda HR-V, although it is a full foot shorter than the larger Rogue. That means that when you're comparing the Juke to the Rogue Sport to the Rogue, the parallel in other brands would be something like the Jeep Renegade, the Jeep Compass, and then the Jeep Cherokee. The larger Rogue is one of the largest crossovers in its compact crossover segment. It's practically a mid-size crossover, and the difference is all back here because in the larger Rogue we have that available third row and we have a very, very large cargo area. To shrink the Rogue Sport from the Rogue, they removed about 2.3 inches of wheelbase, making the seating arrangement a little bit tighter inside so we get a little bit less legroom, front and rear, and then we have about 1/3 less cargo room behind the second row. The overall size of the Rogue Sport puts this very firmly between the average subcompact crossover and the average compact crossover, because this is about 3 inches shorter than a Kia Sportage, which is one of the smallest entries in the compact segment, but again, about 3 inches longer than the HR-V, which is the longest in the subcompact segment. In addition to the overall length of the vehicle shortening, the roof line is a little bit different than the regular Rogue as well, as is the greenhouse line and the sheet metal line that kicks up right there towards the back. The Rogue Sport also gets a little bit closer to the ground, so we have a little bit less ground clearance. We also have different approach, departure, and breakover angles. That was done not only to differentiate the Rogue Sport from the Rogue, but also to give the Rogue Sport a sportier feel out on the road because the suspension is a little bit firmer, we have less body roll, and the overall experience is a little bit sportier than we find in the larger Rogue. Out back, we have LED tail lamps that go from the hatch on over to the body, and they feature a chevron theme that mirrors what we saw up front. We don't find backup sensors even in the top-end SL trim because we do have a 360-degree camera system in this vehicle. We have one camera right here under the Nissan logo, one in the front of the vehicle, and one on each side. All models feature a single exhaust tip over there on the driver's side. As we see in many two-row crossovers, the rear glass is a little bit more raked, giving the rear hatch more of a curved appearance that reduces practicality a little bit, but it helps improve the look from the side. Instead of using the same engine as the Rogue, Nissan chose to downsize for the Rogue Sport. This uses a 2-liter 4-cylinder direct injection engine that's actually the same engine that's found under the hood of the Rogue Hybrid. Of course, in this vehicle, we don't have the hybrid system attached to the vehicle, just a continuously variable transmission in the United States. Power comes in at 141 horsepower and 147 pound-feet of torque. Now, if you live in Canada and you're buying the Nissan Qashqai, which is again identical to the Rogue Sport except for the name on the front, then you can get this same 2-liter 4-cylinder engine with a 6-speed manual transmission in the 2 base trims. Fuel economy on the 2017 EPA cycle comes in at 28 miles per gallon combined for the front-wheel drive model, 27 for the model we're driving right here, which is the all-wheel drive trim. The all-wheel drive fuel economy is identical to the larger Nissan Rogue, and interestingly enough, in front-wheel drive trim, it's actually 1 mile per gallon lower. Nissan tells us that the 1 mile per gallon loss in the combined cycle is all down to the tuning of the Rogue Sport versus the Nissan Rogue and some slight variations in the aerodynamics because this is a shorter vehicle. As we've come to expect from Nissan, front seat comfort is excellent. These are essentially the same seats that we find in the larger Rogue, and they feature Nissan's zero-gravity design. Zero gravity is just their fancy marketing word for seats that are very comfortable and feel like you sink into them a little bit, but still provide a decent amount of support. This particular model has the power driver's seat with the two-way adjustable power lumbar. We also have a tilt telescopic steering column with a large range of motion, making it easier for shorter or taller drivers to find an ideal driving position. But one thing worth noting is that the passenger seat, even in this top-end trim, is still a manual model. The biggest difference between the Rogue and Rogue Sport can be found right back here in the rear passenger area, because we have about 3 inches less overall legroom than we find in the larger model. We also don't have a second row that slides forwards or backwards, and we don't have that available third row. In terms of overall combined legroom, that puts this just a little bit below the Jeep Compass, which is just about the same size as this vehicle overall, but it puts it in about the same category as the Sportage, the Tucson, or the Tiguan. About 3 inches of the size difference between the Rogue and Rogue Sport happens in the passenger area. The rest happens right back here in the cargo area. We find a cargo area that is about 2/3 the size of the larger Rogue. We lose about 10 cubic feet of storage space. We obviously haven't been able to test this vehicle at home with our usual 24-inch roller bags, but my estimate is that this will be able to accommodate 4 of those bags. Cargo practicality is something that Nissan is known for in all of their vehicles, and that is true in this Nissan Sport as well. If I take this bag out of here, you'll notice that instead of 1 load floor, we actually have 2, and they're removable from the vehicle. They're also arrangeable in several different fashions. In their upper position, you can actually put some cargo under them and have it completely obscured from view. The cargo cover in the Rogue Sport is not one of those roller types. It actually is this fixed, flat parcel shelf, but it actually stows right there under the cargo area load floor if you do want to carry larger cargo, and that would be in the way. The major difference between this and the larger Rogue is that this forward divider cannot sit in an upright position, giving you sort of shelves in the cargo area, although the rear divider still lifts up like that, so that way you can keep grocery bags or other cargo from flying forward. As we take a quick look around the interior, keep in mind we are in the top-end SL trim, so of course we do have the leather upholstery. The front seats feature two-way adjustable headrests and height-adjustable seat belts. The leather is perforated. These seats are heated, but they're not ventilated. As you'd expect out of a vehicle that shares a name with the larger Nissan Rogue, the Rogue Sport shares many of the interior parts as well. We have a soft-touch upper section of the doors if you like putting your arm on the door sill. We also have a soft-touch armrest, and the rest of the door panel is a hard plastic. We do have a bottle holder right down there towards the bottom. The dashboard itself is essentially the same as what we find in the larger Nissan Rogue, both in terms of style and in terms of some of the actual parts. The upper part of the dashboard is a soft-touch injection molded component. We don't find a center channel speaker in this particular model, and the lower portions of the dashboard are a hard plastic. Like many Nissan vehicles, the glove compartment is a bin style, and I was able to fit a large tablet computer inside. Moving back over to the center of the dashboard, we have 2 large air vents, start-stop button because we do have keyless go in this particular model. We also have the 7-inch infotainment and navigation system. Now this is not Nissan's latest software that we do find in a select number of vehicles. This is one of their previous generation systems. That's because, as I said earlier, although the Nissan Rogue Sport is new to America, it's not new to the worldwide market, so this has been around for a few years. Although we don't find Apple CarPlay or Android Auto integration, we do have USB iPod integration, an integrated CD player, Sirius XM, and of course integrated navigation. Below that, our trim has dual zone climate control, and you'll find the USB and auxiliary input along with a 12-volt power port just below that. There's also a small storage area right here, although it does not have a lid. Continuing behind that, we have a fairly traditional console shifter. Drive is all the way to the back. There is a manual mode, even though this does use a CVT. We pull the shifter over to the left, and then we push it away from the driver for gear up, pull towards the driver for gear down. Between the front seats, we find 2 generous cup holders, a small storage cubby right here where you can put a cell phone, and then we have the controls for the heated seats on either side. We also have a softly padded leather center armrest, which opens to reveal a moderate-sized storage compartment where you can see I was very easily able to put bottles, wallets, that sort of thing. Even though the Sport is just 1 notch below the Rogue in the lineup, we have the same attractive flat-bottom steering wheel that we find in the larger model. Sport grips right up top. It's a 3-spoke design. The left side of the steering wheel is where we find the controls for the cruise control system, voice command, phone hang-up, and pickup. On the other side of the steering wheel, we have buttons to control the multi-function display between the speedometer and the tachometer, track forward, backward, and volume up, down. Even though the Rogue Sport is about 200 pounds lighter than the full-size Rogue, 0 to 60 acceleration is a little bit slower. That's because we have less power out of this smaller 2-liter 4-cylinder engine. In our preliminary 0 to 60 tests, we scored 9.5 seconds, which is a full second slower than that larger Rogue. The biggest difference between this and the larger Rogue is in the 0 to 30 score, because the 30 to 60 score is actually just about the same between this and the larger model. In our braking scores, we ran from 60 miles an hour back to 0 in 122 feet, which is just a hair shorter than the larger Nissan Rogue, likely because we are driving the top-end trim, which is the heaviest. Keep in mind that these scores are all preliminary because we have not been testing this on our usual test track. Personally, I hope that Nissan chooses to put a larger engine under the hood of the Rogue Sport at some point in time, because the overall chassis tuning is definitely sportier than the larger Rogue. Now, this is not trying to be a Mazda 3, so this does not feel as firm or quite as connected to the driver as that Mazda model, but it definitely feels more connected to the driver and more sporty out here on the road than the larger Rogue, and that's exactly what Nissan was going for. In an interesting twist, the American version of the Qashqai, Rogue Sport, whatever you want to call it, is actually firmer than the European version. Nissan tells us that's because the mission of the vehicle is a little bit different this market to the European market. In Europe, this is actually a fairly large two-row crossover, so it seems to have a more premium demographic, and that demographic wants to have a slightly softer suspension. In America, Nissan is trying to target this vehicle at folks that want something a little bit more compact and a little bit more fun to drive than the larger Rogue. And when we get this out here on winding mountain roads, it is certainly more fun to drive than that larger model. The amount of body roll that we get in the corners is notably lower than the Rogue. It's also notably lower than the Honda HR-V. The HR-V is fairly softly sprung, and we do get a decent amount of body roll when you start really pushing that vehicle into the corners. The independent rear suspension that we find in the Rogue helps out when it comes to handling, because some of the compact crossovers out there don't get a fully independent rear suspension, especially if you're trying to shop this against something like a Kia Soul. That means that when you really start pushing this vehicle in corners on broken roads, the rear end doesn't feel unsettled in the same way that a vehicle without an independent suspension can. Comparisons are a little bit tricky because this is one of those vehicles that tries to straddle the segments. This is not as sporty as a Nissan Juke, but it is sportier than the larger Nissan Rogue. It's not as sporty as a Mazda CX-3. It's actually not quite as sporty as a Mazda CX-5 either, but it is just a little bit closer to the CX-5 than the CX-3. Because of the more sporting mission in the Rogue Sport, I'm going to drop the overall ride score down to a B, because this is notably more firm than the larger Rogue, again more firm than something like a Honda HR-V. Out here on this well-paved road surface, it doesn't really make too much difference, but if you start going off the beaten path, you'll definitely notice that this suspension is firmer. Of course, the one thing you'll definitely notice out on winding mountain roads is that although the suspension is definitely tuned for a more sporting drive, the tires are definitely still tuned for fuel economy. Now, personally, that's a combination I can handle because it's much easier to swap out summer tires or grippier tires on a vehicle like this than to try and adjust your suspension to be more handling oriented. In our cabin noise test, we scored 72 decibels, which puts this fairly in the middle of the pack as far as both the subcompact category and compact category go. Keeping in mind that we have obviously not been driving this on our usual fuel economy test loop in California since we're out here in Tennessee, we have been averaging about 26 miles per gallon over a day and about 120 miles of very mixed driving with 0 to 60 tests and a little bit of idling going on. Those are good fuel economy scores whether you're comparing this with a compact crossover or a subcompact crossover. You'll get better fuel economy in this vehicle than something like a Chevy Trax, although the Honda HR-V is just a notch above this in terms of average fuel economy. As we've come to expect from Nissan, the Rogue Sport is a very middle-of-the-road entry. The suspension is neither too firm nor too soft. It's not the best handling in the segment, but it's not the worst handling either. Although 9.5 seconds 0 to 60 may sound a little bit slow, the 30 to 60 passing performance of the Rogue Sport is just about the same as the regular Nissan Rogue. So when you're driving this out on the road, the initial acceleration may feel a little bit sluggish, but if you're passing cars or you're driving out on a winding mountain road like this doesn't have the same sort of sluggish feel that we get in some of the low-powered entries in the compact and subcompact crossover segments. As you'd expect from a vehicle that falls between segments, the price tag of the Rogue Sport falls between segments as well. It starts at $21,420, but keep in mind that the continuously variable transmission is standard. That's different than something like the Jeep Compass, the Honda HR-V, or your average subcompact crossover, because those all start with manual transmissions. If you want to add all-wheel drive to your Rogue Sport, that will set you back $22,770. I expect the SV trim is going to be the volume trim that starts at $23,020, $24,370 with all-wheel drive. If you were to add all of the options to the Rogue Sport, you'll end up right around $31,000. Although size and pricing obviously fall somewhere between the subcompact and compact crossover segments, it is a little bit closer to the subcompact segment than the compact segment. This is only about $450 more than a base Chevy Trax with the automatic transmission. It's about $1,000 more than a Honda HR-V with their continuously variable transmission. When you're taking a look at the low base price in the Honda HR-V, remember that it does come equipped with the manual. Again, in the United States, this gets the automatic standard. It's also worth noting that Hondas tend to sell very close to their MSRPs, and Nissans tend to be a little bit of a discount over the MSRP in actual real-world transaction pricing. That means that the delta between this and a comparable HRV is going to be a little bit closer than that $1,000. The Rogue Sport is also about $2,500 less than the larger Nissan Rogue, and we're talking about the Rogue with 2 rows, not the Rogue with 3 rows. So if you just compare base prices, this is about $2,500 lower. You will, of course, have to wait until we can get our hands on one for a complete week for our usual detailed analysis of how this compares to the competition. But in a nutshell, the Rogue Sport compares very well. Very much like the Jeep Compass, we get a larger vehicle overall for a price tag that is very similar to your average subcompact crossover. In fact, the Rogue Sport and the Compass are almost exactly the same price when you comparably equip them. The Compass does look like it's a little bit less expensive, but it starts with a 6-speed manual transmission as well. If you had the 6-speed automatic, it's exactly the same price as the Nissan Rogue. Depending on the trim level and the options you select in the Honda HR-V or the Rogue Sport, they'll end up about the same price or perhaps a little bit more expensive over here on the Nissan side versus the Honda HR-V. But remember that this is a larger vehicle overall. It's very obvious right back here in the rear seat area where we get more width than we find in the Honda HR-V. The HR-V has a very, very practical cargo compartment. It actually has more cargo space than we find in this vehicle. It's actually similar to the larger Nissan Rogue, but they do give up some of the comfort in terms of seat comfort and the cabin appointments in order to give you that extra cargo area. My bottom line at the moment for the 2017 Rogue Sport is that if you're shopping in the compact crossover category and you don't mind spending about $500 extra for your vehicle, I would get the Rogue Sport over most of the entries in this category. It's a little bit more comfortable inside, especially in the back row, and we get a little bit more cargo space than the average subcompact crossover, especially something like a Mazda CX-3. It definitely has a sportier feel out on the road versus the regular Rogue, although it's not going to handle or feel like the Mazda CX-3. The only real drawback to the Rogue Sport is that the overall dimensions are definitely a little bit larger than something like the CX-3 or the Chevy Trax. So if you're living in an area where the actual dimensions of the vehicle are your primary concern and you really need a small vehicle in order to fit in that parking spot, then the Rogue Sport might not be an option for you. Thanks for taking the time to check out this video. Again, stay tuned for our complete review of the Rogue Sport when we get our hands on one for a full week. I've been Alex Dykes, and this has been the 2017 Nissan Rogue Sport. I'll see you next week.